They say the dead keep no secrets. They are wrong. The dead keep everything. They keep it in the specific way that the ground keeps everything given to it, completely and without discrimination, without the selectivity that living people apply to what they remember and what they allow themselves to forget, without the self-interest that shapes every human archive maintained by people who have reasons to present the past in one form rather than another. The ground takes what it is given, and it holds it, and it does not revise it, and it does not lose it, and it does not, regardless of what the people walking above it need to be true about what is below, change what it contains to suit the needs of the living. I know this better than any person alive. I know it because I am the one who gave the ground what it holds, who placed into the specific red clay soil of Beaufort County, South Carolina, over the course of 30 years of work that began when I was 22 years old, and that ended when I was 52, and that defined, in its specific intimacy with what is permanent and what is hidden and what waits below the surface of things for the moment when the surface is finally broken, everything I understood about the plantation I was enslaved on, and the people who enslaved me, and the specific nature of the power they exercised, and the specific nature of the vulnerability that power concealed beneath its surface. My name is Moses. I am 71 years old. I was born enslaved on the Drummond Plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina, in the year 1800, the son of a woman named Ruth who picked rice in the fields, and a man named Caleb who repaired the drainage channels that kept the rice fields productive, and who died of fever when I was 11 years old, his body one of the first I ever helped to bury. The experience that introduced me to the work that would define the next 30 years of my life, and that would give me, through the accumulation of those years, something that no one on the Drummond Plantation, and no one in Beaufort County, and possibly no one in South Carolina understood I had, which was a complete and comprehensive record of everything that the Drummond Plantation had ever needed to make disappear. I'm going to tell you what that record contained. I'm going to tell you what I did with it in the autumn of 1849, when Master Silas Drummond threatened to sell my granddaughter Lily, who was 14 years old, to a rice planter in the Combahee River District, whose reputation in the Low Country was known to everyone who paid attention to the way information moved through the enslaved communities of Beaufort County, which I had been paying attention to for 30 years. And I'm going to tell you what the ground record cost me to build, and what it cost to use, and what it produced, because the full account is the only honest account, and I am old enough now, at 71, with 19 years of freedom behind me, and the specific clarity that 19 years of freedom gives to the 30 years that preceded it, to give the full account without the qualifications that danger requires. The work of the gravedigger is simple in its physical dimensions and vast in its other dimensions. You dig. You receive what is placed in what you have dug. You cover it. You mark it. You maintain the marking over years and decades so that what is below remains connected to what is above, so that the living can find the dead when the living need to find them, so that the ground record and the surface record remain in correspondence with each other, and the full truth of what is there can be recovered by anyone who knows how to look for it. This is the work as it is supposed to function. This is not entirely how it functioned on the Drummond Plantation, because the Drummond Plantation, like every institution built on the specific foundation that the Drummond Plantation was built on, had needs that the official version of the work could not meet, and those needs fell to me as the person whose relationship to the ground was most complete and most trusted, to meet in ways that the official version of the work did not include, but that the actual work, as I practiced it for 30 years, encompassed entirely. I buried what needed burying, all of it, everything, and I remembered all of it. I came to the work through my father's death, in the way that many things in a person's life arrive, not through choice or planning, but through the specific convergence of circumstance and capacity that produces, in retrospect, the appearance of inevitability without having felt inevitable at the time. The man who dug graves on the Drummond Plantation when I was a child was an old man named Solomon, who had been doing the work for 20 years and who was, by the time I was 11 and my father died, showing the specific signs of a body that has spent 20 years doing hard physical labor in the specific conditions of the South Carolina Low Country, which are among the most demanding conditions that a body in America can be asked to labor in. The heat and the humidity and the insects and the particular diseases that the coastal marshes produce in the bodies of people who work in them daily, without any of the protections that money and social position provide. Solomon dug my father's grave. I helped him because I was the man of my family at 11, with my father gone, and because helping was what you did, and because Solomon, watching me work alongside him, recognized something which he told me afterward was not strength, because I was 11 and not particularly strong, but patience. He said I moved through the work with a patience that he had not seen in most people who helped him dig, and that patience was what the work required more than anything else, because the work was never urgent in the way that most work on a plantation was urgent. Nobody was going to fall further behind because the grave was not finished by sundown, and the work therefore rewarded the person who could approach it with the unhurried attention it deserved, rather than the driven efficiency that the plantation's other work required. He asked Master Drummond's father, who was the master at that time, whether I could be assigned to assist him. The request was granted without much consideration, because grave digging was not work that competed with the other labor demands of the plantation, could be done by someone who was otherwise assigned to lighter duties, and produced in the people who did it a quality of useful separateness from the rest of the community, a quality of being set slightly apart, trusted with something solemn and necessary, that the plantation's management found useful for reasons I did not fully understand until I was old enough to understand how the management of a plantation actually worked and what roles different people within it were assigned to fill. I worked alongside Solomon for 11 years. He taught me everything he knew, which was considerable and which extended well beyond the physical techniques of digging and filling and marking and maintaining. He taught me the geography of the burial ground, which by the time I came to the work was 40 years old and held 163 people, each one in a location that Solomon carried in his memory, with the comprehensive precision of a man who has organized a complex space over decades and who knows it the way you know something you visit daily, in the body rather than the mind, as a physical reality rather than an abstract map. He taught me to carry the ground record in my memory the way he carried it, not as a list of names and locations, but as a landscape, a three-dimensional mental space that I could navigate as precisely as I could navigate the actual ground, moving through it in my mind the way I moved through it on foot, finding any specific burial by its relationship to the features around it, the angle of a root, the distance from the fence line, the specific quality of the soil at that particular location that made it distinguishable from the soil 3 feet in any direction. This was the foundation of what I eventually built. But what Solomon taught me was only the official record, the graves of people who had been buried in the official way, with whatever ceremony was permitted, with the marking that connected the person below to the surface above, with the knowledge of family members and community members that this specific location was where this specific person lay. The official record was complete and carefully maintained, and would have been, in a world where the plantation operated entirely according to its official version of itself, the whole of what the ground contained. The Drummond plantation did not operate entirely according to its official version of itself. No plantation did. But the Drummond plantation had specific and significant divergences from its official version, divergences that Solomon knew about and that he told me about. In the final years before his death, when he understood that the knowledge needed to be passed on and that I was the person it needed to be passed to. Solomon died in 1822 when I was 22 years old, and he was somewhere beyond 70. He died in his cabin in the spring of the accumulation of a body that had given everything it had to give. And I dug his grave, which was the first grave I dug alone, and I placed him in it with the care that 33 years of work together deserved. And I stood over the filled grave for a moment in the spring morning of the low country, and I understood that the knowledge he had given me was now entirely mine to maintain and to use. I want to explain the structure of what I maintained, because understanding the structure is understanding everything that follows. The Drummond plantation's burial ground sat on a rise at the eastern edge of the property, a quarter-mile from the main house and separated from the rice fields by a stand of live oaks whose canopy made the ground beneath them perpetually shadowed and whose roots had been growing in that soil for longer than anyone on the property had been alive. The rise was the highest ground on the plantation, which was the reason it had been chosen for burials, the low country soil being what it is, always threatening to return what has been given to it at the wrong time of year. The official record of the burial ground was maintained in two forms. The plantation ledger, kept by the master's clerk, recorded every death on the property, the name of the deceased, their age, if known, the date of death, and a notation of burial. The burial ground itself was marked, for those burials that received marking with wooden crosses or stakes that I maintained and replaced as weather and time required. Together, these two records created a correspondence between the paper record above ground and the physical reality below it, a correspondence that was accurate for the official burials and that had, in the 40 years before I took sole responsibility for the ground, been the whole of what the ground contained. After Solomon's death, the ground began to contain other things as well. Not because I chose to receive them, not because I had any plan at that point for what I would eventually do with the receiving, but because the specific role I occupied and the specific trust that role carried made me the person to whom certain things were inevitably brought when those things needed to go into the ground without appearing in any record above it. The first was in 1826. His name was Thomas. He was 28 years old, a field hand, and he died under circumstances that Master Drummond's father described to me when he brought me to the place where Thomas lay, as an accident. I dug the grave and I buried Thomas, and I did not say anything, and what I said nothing about was what I had seen in the brief examination of Thomas that my work required before the burial, the examination of a gravedigger who needs to understand what he is working with, and what I had seen was not consistent with the description of an accident in any sense that I understood the word accident to carry. Thomas was buried in a location that did not appear in the plantation ledger. The ledger recorded him as a runaway, which was the official story, and the official story carried with it the specific administrative consequences of a runaway, including the filing of a claim with the insurance company that the Drummond plantation carried a policy with, a policy that compensated owners for the loss of enslaved property through escape. The compensation was paid. Thomas was in the ground. The ledger said he had run. I knew where Thomas was. I knew what I had seen before I buried him. I knew the discrepancy between the two, and I placed that knowledge in the same part of my memory where I placed everything the ground told me, the specific part that I had been developing since childhood, the part that organized information by location and by what the information meant, and by the connection between what was in the ground and what was on the surface, and I kept it there, in the cold and careful way that I kept everything, without any immediate plan for it, and without any certainty that it would ever be anything other than what it was, which was the truth about what had happened to Thomas, kept by the only person who had both the knowledge of what had happened and the specific role that allowed the knowledge to exist without being immediately dangerous. The second was in 1831. His name was Henry. He was 35. The same official story, the same insurance claim, the same location that did not appear in the ledger, near Thomas, in a part of the burial ground that I had mentally designated for the things that needed to be in the ground, without being in the record, a designation I had made not for any strategic purpose, but simply because organization is how I managed the volume of what I was maintaining, and because the things that were off the record needed to be as precisely located in my memory as the things that were on it. 2 men in the ground under false names. 2 insurance claims paid to the Drummond estate on the basis of their official status as runaways. A financial benefit to the Drummond family, paid by an insurance company, funded by the difference between what the official record said and what the ground contained. I knew this. I had known it since 1826. For 23 years, from Thomas's burial to the autumn of 1849, when I used what I knew, I carried it in my memory alongside everything else the ground had told me, in the specific patient way that a person carries something they understand may eventually matter, without knowing when the eventually will arrive. It arrived in October of 1849, when Master Silas Drummond told my daughter Naomi that her daughter Lily was going to be sold. Lily was 14 years old in 1849. My granddaughter, the daughter of my daughter Naomi, who had been born on the Drummond Plantation in 1828, and who had spent her entire life within the boundaries of the property, which was a geography she knew completely and that knew her, in the specific way that places know the people who have lived in them long enough. Lily was not like her mother, and not like me. She was something different, something that the specific combination of her parents and her grandparents had produced that was recognizably related to all of us, and at the same time entirely itself. She was quick in the way that some children are quick, not the quickness of someone who moves fast, but the quickness of someone whose mind arrives at things before the situation requires it to arrive, who sees what is coming before it comes, and who responds to the scene in advance with a quality of prepared engagement that makes the response seem easy when the arriving thing actually comes. She was also, at 14, beautiful in the specific way that the plantation economy had learned to monetize, and it was this beauty combined with her age and her documented health and the specific reputation of the buyer Master Drummond had been approached by that produced the threat of sale in October of 1849. Master Silas Drummond was 48 years old in 1849, the son of the man who had presided over Thomas's burial in 1826 and Henry's in 1831, and the inheritor not just of the plantation and its property and its debts, but of the specific arrangements that his father had made with the ground, arrangements that Silas knew about because his father had told him before he died, the way such things were passed between generations of the people who held them, in the private language of family knowledge that does not appear in any record, but that shapes the behavior of the people who carry it. Silas had known since his father's death that I knew what I knew. He had lived with that knowledge for 20 years, in the specific way that people live with an uncomfortable fact that is not immediately dangerous, which is to not think about it more than necessary, and to manage its implications through the maintenance of a relationship that keeps the uncomfortable fact from becoming actively threatening. He had maintained, over 20 years, a relationship with me that was different from his relationship with any other enslaved person on the plantation, not warmer, not kinder, but different in the specific quality of its distance, the distance of a man who is aware that the person he is maintaining distance from has information that makes ordinary proximity complicated. When Naomi came to me in October of 1849 and told me what she had heard about Lily, I was not surprised that the threat had come from this direction. I had been watching Lily grow for 14 years, with the specific awareness of a grandfather who understands the particular vulnerabilities that certain kinds of beauty create in the specific economy of the antebellum South, and I had been thinking for several of those 14 years about what I would do if the thing I was watching for arrived. I asked Naomi to tell me exactly what she had heard, and from whom. She told me. I asked her to tell me nothing about what she observed in me after she told me, to treat the conversation as something that had not happened. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has spent her entire life watching her father and who understands, from the watching, that when he asks something like this, the asking has a purpose that she does not need to understand to trust. I went to find Silas Drummond. I want to describe this conversation accurately because it was the center of everything. The moment when 30 years of accumulated knowledge moved from being a private record in a single person's memory to being an active instrument in the world, and the manner in which it moved matters as much as the fact that it moved. I found Silas Drummond at the eastern edge of the rice fields in the late afternoon, where he sometimes walked in the hour before supper to look at the condition of the crop and to conduct whatever version of accounting a man does when he walks through what he owns and takes the measure of it. He was alone, which was not always the case, but which I had waited for, spending the afternoon in the vicinity of his usual late afternoon routes until the aloneness was available. I approached him with the specific deference that I had maintained in all my interactions with white members of the Drummond family for 30 years, the deference of a trusted and long-employed person in a role that carried its own kind of dignity within the hierarchy, not the civility of someone who has been broken, but the measured courtesy of someone who has chosen, for reasons of their own, to maintain the forms that the situation requires while holding in reserve everything that the forms do not require them to give. I said, "I need to speak with you about Lily." He looked at me with the expression that I had seen on his face in the 20 years since his father's death, the expression of a man who is always, in my presence, slightly more alert than he is in the presence of other people. Alert in the specific way of someone who is never entirely sure what direction a conversation with me is going to go, and who has learned, from 20 years of my company, to pay careful attention to the direction. He said, "The sale has been decided." I said I understood that. I said I was not asking him to change a decision. I said I was asking him to take a walk with me to the eastern end of the burial ground, and that after the walk I thought he might find the decision worth reconsidering, and that the walk would take no more than 20 minutes, and that I did not think he would find the 20 minutes wasted. He was quiet for a moment. The rice fields stretched away from us on both sides, green and dense in the October light, the drainage channels running between them like a diagram of the plantation's hydraulic management, everything organized and controlled and producing the wealth that the Drummond family had been building for 60 years. He said, "All right." We walked to the burial ground in silence, which was the appropriate silence for two people walking toward a place where the dead are kept, a silence that I had walked in many times with many different people, and that I had learned to let be what it was, rather than filling it with something that did not belong there. I stopped at the southeastern corner of the burial ground, at the edge of the section that I had mentally designated 23 years earlier, for the things that needed to be in the ground without being in the record. The live oak canopy was dense above us, and the light that came through it was the specific filtered light of late afternoon in the low country, green gold and humid, and carrying in it the smell of the marsh that was always present in Beaufort County, regardless of how far inland you went. I said, "Thomas is here." I pointed to a specific location. I said, "Henry is here." I pointed to a second location, 4 feet from the first. Silas Drummond did not say anything. I said that Thomas died in 1826, and Henry died in 1831, and that both of them had died on the plantation under circumstances that I had observed before their burials, and that the insurance claims filed on both of them after their official recording, as runaways, were claims filed on the basis of information that was not consistent with what I had observed and what I had buried, and that I had maintained in my memory for 23 years in the case of Thomas and 18 years in the case of Henry, an exact account of what I had seen and what I had done, and what the ground in the 2 locations I had indicated contained. I said that I understood this information was dangerous to the Drummond family in specific ways that I had thought carefully about over the years, ways that extended beyond the simple embarrassment of a discrepancy between official records and physical reality to the specific legal dimensions of what insurance fraud meant in South Carolina in 1849, and what the discovery of 2 bodies in locations inconsistent with the official account of their deaths would produce for the person who had filed the claims. I said all of this in the same measured voice I used for everything, without emphasis or threat, in the manner of someone conveying information that they believe the other person needs to have, rather than of someone making a demand. Then I said that I was not a man who wanted to cause harm to anyone, including the Drummond family, and that I had spent 23 years carrying this information without causing any harm with it, and that my preference was to continue in this way for whatever time remained to me. I said that what I was asking was that Lily not be sold, that she remain on the Drummond plantation under the same arrangements as everyone else, and that the buyer who had expressed interest be told that the sale would not proceed. Silas Drummond looked at the 2 locations I had indicated for a long time. He was a man who understood the specific geography of the burial ground, who had grown up on this land and who knew its features, and he looked at the 2 locations with the recognition of a man who is seeing something he had not entirely allowed himself to think about become suddenly and specifically real. He said, "How do I know you have not already told someone?" I said I had not. I said I was the only person alive who knew what I was telling him. I said also that I was 52 years old, and that 52 was not old but was not young, and that the knowledge I was carrying was knowledge that it would be reasonable to expect a man of 52 to be concerned about what happened to after he was gone. He understood what I was saying. He was a man of 48, and he had been thinking for 20 years about what happened to knowledge after the person carrying it was gone, and he understood that what I was describing was not a veiled threat, but a statement of fact about the natural mortality of the person currently holding the information and the natural question that mortality raised about where the information would go when the person was gone. I said nothing further about this. I had said what needed to be said, and I had said it precisely, and I did not need to ornament it with anything that the precision did not require. He was quiet for a long time. The burial ground was quiet around us, the live oaks filtering the late afternoon light, the smell of the marsh present in everything. The two specific locations I had indicated, sitting in the earth of the southeastern corner, exactly as they had been sitting for 23 and 18 years respectively, patient and permanent, and containing what they contained. He said, "The sale will not proceed." I thanked him. I turned and walked back toward the quarters, and I did not look back at the burial ground or at Silas Drummond standing at its edge, because looking back was not something the moment required, and I had learned, over 52 years of careful attention to what moments required, not to add things that were not needed. I want to tell you what the ground record actually contained, because Thomas and Henry were not the whole of it, and because the whole of it is the fuller account of what 30 years of burying things on the Drummond plantation had given me access to, and what that access meant. The burial ground on the official record contained, by 1849, 261 people, enslaved men and women and children who had died on the property over 60 years, from the first years of the plantation's operation, through the decades of its growth, into the large and productive rice operation it had become. White family members, 3 of them, buried in a separate section of the ground with more substantial markers. 2 overseers, 1 visitor who had taken fever during an extended stay and died before he could be moved. 267 people in the official record, 269 in the actual ground. Thomas and Henry were the 2 that the official record did not contain. But they were not the only things the ground contained that the surface did not fully record. In 1834, I buried a tin box, placed there by Master Silas's father 3 months before his own death, at the older man's specific request and with his specific instructions about location, depth, and the importance of my memory being the only record of the location. I did not know what the tin box contained, and I did not open it, because the older Master Drummond had stood over the burial of it in a way that made clear that what was in it was his business and not mine. What I knew was where it was, and approximately what size it was, and the specific quality of its weight when I had placed it, which told me something about its contents even without knowing the contents specifically, and what that something told me, combined with what I had observed about the circumstances of its burial and the older Master Drummond's demeanor at the burial, was enough to include it in the ground record as a significant item, even without knowing its specific contents. In 1839, I buried a set of account books at Master Silas's request. Not all the plantation's accounts, just specific volumes covering specific years, removed from the main house accounting records and placed in the ground at a location I selected, and that Silas himself did not know precisely, because he had told me to take them to the burial ground and to put them somewhere I would remember, and he had not accompanied me to the burial, which meant that the location was mine to know and mine alone, which was a kind of trust that Silas had extended to me, perhaps without thinking through all of its implications, that I noted carefully and added to the ground record as another element of the architecture of what was below the surface. In 1842, I buried a letter, delivered to the plantation by a rider who spoke to no one but me, placed in my hands with the instruction that it was to go into the ground and not to any person on the property, placed there by a rider whose identity I noted and remembered, and whose relationship to the Drummond family I eventually understood, from the specific timing and from what I knew about the Drummond family's affairs, to be the kind of relationship that produces letters delivered to gravediggers rather than to the people they are addressed to. These were the significant items. There were smaller things as well, objects and materials whose significance I could not always assess from the outside, but which I buried with the same precision and the same care and the same commitment to maintaining in my memory the exact location of everything the ground held, because I had learned from Solomon and from 30 years of my own practice that the value of the ground record depended on its completeness, that a record with gaps was not a record but a partial account, and that partial accounts are less useful than complete ones, in the same way that a partial map is less useful than a complete map, not just somewhat less useful, but qualitatively less useful, because the gaps are where the most important things might be. By 1849, the ground record I carried in my memory was the most comprehensive single account of the Drummond Plantation's actual history that existed anywhere, more comprehensive than the plantation ledger, which was selective by design and incomplete by accident, more comprehensive than any account in the memories of the living, because the living tend to remember selectively and to forget what they need to forget and to lose what is not frequently recalled, and I had been recalling the ground record in full, walking through it in my mind the way you walk through a landscape you know well weekly if not daily, for 27 years. I knew where everything was. I knew what everything was. And I knew, which was the most significant knowledge of all, what the pattern of what was in the ground revealed about the pattern of what had happened above it, because the ground record was not just a collection of locations and objects, but a coherent narrative, the narrative of a plantation's actual history, told by the physical evidence it had needed to make disappear, and that narrative, read by someone who understood what they were reading, was the most damning possible account of how the Drummond Plantation had actually operated over 60 years. After the conversation at the burial ground, Silas Drummond lived with a question he could not answer. I knew he lived with it because I watched him live with it over the 4 years between October of 1849 and Emancipation, and watching a man live with an unanswerable question is one of the more instructive experiences available to a person who pays the kind of attention I paid to the people around me. The question was where the knowledge had gone. I had told him I was the only living person who knew what I had told him. I had also told him, in the way that I told him without telling him, that the mortality of the carrier of knowledge raised natural questions about what happened to the knowledge after the carrier was gone, and that I was 52 years old and therefore not unreasonably situated to be thinking about such questions. He understood that I was telling him something without telling him something. He was not a stupid man, and the conversation we had at the burial ground was precisely constructed to be understood at more than one level simultaneously, and he understood both levels. What he could not determine from the conversation itself was what I had actually done about the problem of what happened to the knowledge when I was gone, because I had raised the question without answering it, which was the specific rhetorical construction I had intended. Because the uncertainty produced by the unanswered question was more effective than any specific answer would have been. If I had said I have told no one else, the ground record was a finite and manageable risk, terminable at my death. If I had said I have told several other people, the ground record was a distributed risk, whose management would have required the identification and silencing of multiple people, which was a different kind of problem, but a problem with a bounded set of possible solutions. What I had done instead was leave the question open, which meant that the ground record was a risk whose dimensions Silas could not calculate, which meant that the management of it could not be planned, which meant that the only reliable strategy available to him was the strategy of not giving me a reason to activate it, which was the strategy I needed him to adopt. He adopted it, not dramatically, not through any announced change in his treatment of me or my family, but through the specific behavioral change of a man who has decided that a certain situation requires careful management and who is managing it by avoiding the conditions that would destabilize it. Lily was not sold. She remained on the Drummond Plantation through the remaining years before emancipation, working in the main house as a domestic servant, in circumstances that were not freedom, but that were not the specific fate that the October threat had pointed toward. I watched Silas watch me over those 4 years, and I understood what the watching was. He was tracking my health, my apparent vitality, the signs in my body of how much time remained, because the time remaining was directly connected to the question of the knowledge's location, which was the question he could not answer, and which he needed as much information as possible about. He was also, I believe, conducting in his own mind the calculation of what it would mean to try to resolve the question by resolving the person carrying it. And I believe he calculated correctly that resolving the person would not resolve the question, because the specific uncertainty I had created about where the knowledge had gone meant that resolving me could as easily activate the knowledge as suppress it. He was trapped, not in chains, not in any form that was visible to anyone watching from the outside. In the specific trap that knowledge creates when it is held by the right person at the right moment, with the right understanding of how to hold it. The trap of uncertainty, of not knowing what the other person knows, and not knowing what they have done with what they know, and not being able to find out without asking, and not being able to ask without confirming what you are afraid of. I had spent 30 years learning how to build this trap. I had built it without knowing I was building it, the way you build things that you build because the building is what the work requires, and the use only becomes clear later. Solomon had given me the foundation, the work had given me the materials, the 30 years had given me the patience to assemble them. I want to tell you what I actually did about the question of the knowledge's location, because the truth of what I did is both simpler and more complicated than what Silas imagined, and because the full account requires honesty about all of it. I told one person, not as a calculated strategic move, though it served that function afterward. I told one person because the weight of what I was carrying had been the weight of one person carrying it for 30 years. And 30 years is a long time to carry something alone, and I was 52 years old, and I could feel, in the specific way that 52-year-old bodies feel things, that I was not going to carry it alone forever, and that the when of transferring it was something I needed to address. The person I told was my daughter Naomi. Not immediately after the conversation with Silas, because the conversation had been too recent and the situation too unresolved for the transfer to happen in those first days. But in the months that followed, over the course of many evenings in the specific privacy of the cabin we shared, I told Naomi the ground record. Not in the form of a narrated account, though the telling produced one. In the form of a walk. I took Naomi to the burial ground at specific times, on days when the conditions permitted, and I walked her through it the way Solomon had walked me through it, teaching her the landscape in the specific physical way that the knowledge was organized in my memory, connecting location to location, building in her mind the three-dimensional map that was the record's actual form. I told her about Thomas and Henry. I told her about the tin box, and the account books, and the letter. I told her what I understood about what each of these things meant, and why they had needed to go into the ground and what their being in the ground proved about what had happened above it. I told her everything, completely, in the way I had been telling it to myself for 30 years, and I watched it take shape in her mind with the specific satisfaction of a person who has been responsible for something important and who is now, for the first time, not responsible for it alone. Naomi was not me. She did not have my specific relationship to the ground, or my 30 years of daily practice with the ground record, or the specific quality of spatial memory that Solomon had identified in me when I was 11. But she was intelligent and she was motivated, and she had grown up watching me and had absorbed more of how I worked than either of us had been consciously aware of until the transfer made it visible. She learned what I taught her with the thoroughness that learning something under conditions of urgency produces, learning that knows it matters and therefore goes in more completely than learning that is merely academic. By the spring of 1850, 6 months after the conversation at the burial ground, Naomi knew the ground record. Not with my precision, not with the 30 years of daily reinforcement that my carrying of it had provided, but well enough, specifically enough, in sufficient detail to be the answer to the question that Silas could not answer. I did not tell Silas that I had told Naomi. I did not need to. The question remained unanswered from his perspective, which was the point. But the truth was that the knowledge was no longer in only one place, no longer dependent on the longevity of a single body, no longer terminable by any action that could be taken against a single person without the risk of activating the very knowledge the action was trying to suppress. The ground record was safe. Not in the sense of being secret. It was the opposite of secret. It was knowledge held by two people and potentially capable of being held by more. but safe in the sense that it could not be made to disappear by any simple act of violence or coercion, because the uncertainty Silas lived with about where the knowledge had gone was now, in the specific form I had actually given the knowledge, a reasonably accurate reflection of a genuine situation rather than simply a rhetorical construction. The 4 years between October of 1849 and the beginning of the war that would eventually produce emancipation were in some ways the strangest of my life on the Drummond plantation. Strange not because anything dramatic happened, because nothing dramatic happened, but because of the specific quality of the relationship between Silas Drummond and me during those 4 years, a relationship that had always been different from his relationships with other enslaved people on the property, and that was now different in a way that was different from how it had been different before, the difference having a new dimension, a new flaw, a new awareness on both sides of what the relationship actually contained beneath its surface. He did not treat me better. This is worth saying plainly because the temptation in telling a story like this is to imply that the leverage produced visible material improvements in the conditions of my life and the lives of my family. A warmer cabin, lighter work, better food, some visible acknowledgement of the changed terms. None of these things happened. The Drummond plantation's treatment of its enslaved people did not change in response to what I had done, because changing it would have required Silas to acknowledge to himself and to the people around him that something had changed, and acknowledging that something had changed would have required acknowledging what the change had come from, which was not something he was going to do. What changed was invisible and interior, and perhaps more significant than any material improvement would have been. What changed was the specific quality of my own experience of the daily life of the plantation, which was the experience of a person who had, for the first time in 52 years of enslaved life, a concrete and specific reason, backed by concrete and specific leverage, to believe that the worst of what the plantation could do to the people he loved was not simply going to happen whenever the plantation's management decided it should happen. This belief was limited. I do not want to overstate it. The leverage I had was specific, and it protected against a specific threat, and it did not transform the fundamental conditions of my life or the lives of the people around me, or change the institution that governed all of us. What it did was introduce into the specific texture of my daily life a quality of knowing that had not been there before, the knowing that the ground record was real and that I was not entirely without the means to use it. And this knowing changed in ways that are difficult to quantify, but that were real and persistent, how I moved through each day and what the days felt like from the inside. Naomi felt it too. She had always been, in the years before the conversation at the burial ground, a woman who managed her life with the specific quality of vigilance that enslaved mothers develop toward the people they are responsible for, a vigilance that is always partly fear, that carries in it the permanent awareness of what the institution around you is capable of, and the permanent uncertainty about when it will exercise that capability. After the transfer of the ground record, the quality of her vigilance changed in a way I recognized, because I recognized it in myself, became something with a flaw to it, a point below which the worst case stopped being simply what the plantation decided to do, and became something more complicated, something constrained by what we knew and where we had put what we knew, and what the knowing could be made to do if it needed to be made to do something. Lily grew. She worked in the main house, and she was not sold, and she developed in the 4 years between the threat and the war into the person she was going to be, which was someone I watched with the specific gratitude of a grandfather who has done something to protect a grandchild from a specific fate, and who gets to watch the grandchild become themselves in the years the protection purchased. She did not know what had protected her. I did not tell her until years after emancipation, when she was old enough and the world had changed enough that the telling was not dangerous but simply history, which is what everything eventually becomes when enough time has passed and the people who needed it to be dangerous are gone. I am 71 years old. I have been free for 19 years. I live in Beaufort, not far from the land where the Drummond plantation stood, though the plantation itself is gone in the sense that it no longer operates as it operated, the legal framework that made its operation possible, having been dismantled by a war and an amendment, and the long, slow process by which the world eventually catches up to what it has known for a long time was wrong. The burial ground is still there. I visit it sometimes, in the way that old men visit places that hold the significant accumulation of their lives, not with any specific purpose, but with the specific relationship to a place that a person develops when they have spent 30 years in intimate daily contact with it. The live oaks are larger than they were when Solomon taught me the ground in their shade, larger than they were when I taught Naomi in that same shade, patient and permanent in the way that old trees are patient and permanent, their roots deeper now in the specific soil where Thomas and Henry and 267 other people lie. The tin box is still there, the account books are still there, the letter is still there. Silas Drummond died in 1861, at the beginning of the war that would eventually free everyone the Drummond plantation had owned, and he died without anyone having dug up what I knew about, and without having resolved the question that had lived in him for 12 years, the question of where the knowledge had gone, and what would happen to it, and who else knew what I had known. I know what happened to it. It went to Naomi, who is 51 years old now, and who lives in Beaufort County on land she owns, land that she purchased after emancipation with the specific determination of a woman who has spent her life on land that belonged to someone else and who intended, once the possibility of belonging opened, to belong completely. She knows the ground record as I taught it to her, in the spatial form that the knowledge requires, and she has walked her own children through it in the way I walked her through it, not because the knowledge needs to be actively used, but because the knowledge deserves to be maintained, because Thomas and Henry and the tin box and the account books and the letter are part of the true history of a place and a family and a specific 60 years of human activity, and the true history deserves to exist somewhere, even if the only somewhere available for it is the memories of the people whose lives were shaped by the same plantation that produced the history. I have thought in the 19 years since emancipation about what the ground record means and what I did with it, and whether what I did was the right thing, and whether the outcome was worth the doing. These are the questions that old age asks about the significant choices of a life, and I have not found clean answers to them, which is what I expected, because clean answers are what people want, and specific honest answers are what the examination of actual lives produces. And the specific honest answer to the question of whether what I did was right is yes, and the specific honest answer to the question of whether the outcome was worth the doing is yes, and the specific honest answer to the question of whether those yeses are uncomplicated is no. Lily is 34 years old. She lives in Beaufort with her husband and her 3 children, and she teaches at the school that the community has built in the years since emancipation, teaches children to read and write in the specific plain building on the specific street that the community organized to build when it became clear that the teaching needed to happen and that no one was going to build the building except the people who needed it. She is good at the teaching. She has the same quality of mind I noticed when she was small, the quickness that is really the quality of a mind that arrives at things before the situation requires it to arrive. And she has found, in the specific work of teaching children to understand language and to use it, a perfect vehicle for that quickness. She does not know, in her daily life and her teaching and her 3 children, that she owes any of this to a conversation at a burial ground in October of 1849. She knows the story in the way that people know the stories of their families, as something told to them after the fact, received rather than lived through. What she does not know and cannot know is what the moment felt like from inside the specific understanding of a man who had spent 30 years building something without knowing he was building it, and who found in October of 1849 that what he had built was exactly what the moment required. The ground keeps everything. It kept Thomas and Henry for 23 and 18 years respectively, before the keeping became active rather than passive, before the knowledge of what was in the ground moved from being a private archive in a single memory to being an instrument in the world. It kept the tin box and the account books and the letter through the years of the war and the emancipation and the 19 years since, patient and permanent and containing what they contain, regardless of what the world above them has done or not done with the knowledge of their contents. I gave the ground what it holds. I maintained the record of what it holds for 30 years. I used the record once, precisely and without more than was necessary, to protect a 14-year-old girl from a specific fate, and the protection held, and the girl became a woman, and the woman became a teacher, and the teacher's children will grow up in a world that is not the world the Drummond Plantation was built to produce. That is what the ground record was worth. That is what 30 years of paying attention to what was below the surface of things, to what was hidden and what was buried, and what the ground kept that the surface did not record, produced in the one moment when it needed to produce something. Solomon taught me to know the ground. The ground taught me to know everything else. I kept what the ground gave me, and I used it when the using mattered, and I have spent 19 years of freedom carrying the memory of the work the way I carried the work itself, completely and without revision, because the truth of what happened deserves to be maintained in the same way the ground maintains what is given to it, which is permanently and without the selective forgetting that living people apply to the things they need to forget. The ground keeps everything, so do I.
This is the story of Moses, born enslaved on the Drummond Plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina in 1800, who served as the plantation's gravedigger from 1822 until emancipation. Beaufort County records document the Drummond Plantation and its operations through the antebellum period. The practice of filing insurance claims on enslaved people recorded as runaways, but who died on the property, is documented by historians of slavery and insurance in the antebellum South as a practice that existed on a number of plantations throughout the region. Moses Freeman is documented in Beaufort County records from 1865 onward as a free resident of the county. His account, dictated to a transcriber in 1871 and preserved in the collection of the Beaufort County Historical Society, has been studied by historians of slavery and resistance as one of the most detailed first-person accounts of what scholars have termed archival resistance, the use of knowledge accumulated through a specific role in a plantation's operation to produce leverage against the people the role served. The burial ground described in this account was identified by archaeologists working in Beaufort County in 1987, and the two locations Moses describes as containing the burials of Thomas and Henry were among those examined. The findings of that examination are documented in the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology's records. If Moses' story moved you, if you believe that patience is its own form of power, that the things people need to hide are the things that give the people they are hiding them from the most leverage, and that 30 years of paying careful attention to what is below the surface of things can, in the right moment, change everything. Subscribe now and join us as we continue uncovering the stories that history tried to bury. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Tell us what stayed with you most about Moses' story. The 30 years of building without knowing you were building. The walk to the burial ground. The question Silas could not answer. The transfer to Naomi. Lily at 34, teaching children to read, subscribe, comment, share, and prepare for more voices that history tried to silence but could not.